Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to the first debut episode of Searching for Dragons. So I'm joined today by my co-host and good friend, Graham. How's it going, Graham?
I'm great. How are you?
Amazing, amazing. So we've been doing a bunch of different interviews on here together over the last couple months. And we've mostly been talking about your poetry, but we also talked about one of your favorite poets, Antonin Artaud. And we were discussing, just a bunch of different poets and people who are in a similar vein to Artaud, right? And got this idea about maybe we should do a podcast talking about people who are kind of in a similar vein, right?
Yeah,
So it's like the idea behind this show really is we want to look for artists, not just poets, though today we're going to be discussing a poet, and Antonin Artaud is a playwright and a philosopher, I guess.
yeah,
Kind of doing all kinds of things. But the idea is we want to talk about artists who are approaching life and the world from sort of like a magical perspective, right?
exactly.
Like, how would you describe like Artaud's perspective? Just so people understand what we're looking for and where we're coming from.
Yeah, so Artaud was very much about utilizing ritual and magical practice in your daily life and in your art in a way to enrich your life and to overcome suffering.
Right.
In a nutshell, I guess would be a good way to put it.
Yeah, and there's like this deep embodiment of the world in Artaud. There's this kind of a pantheism that you see, this connection to nature, and this desire sort of to go through this cycle of death and rebirth, of transformation. One thing
Exactly.
that stood out to me about Artaud is that that willingness. He kind of describes this journey of self-destruction and then goes through a journey of self-destruction, and rebirth. And it's such an intrinsic kind of thing to him. And this how he talks about like the way that the body relates to the natural world and all of this stuff. It's so deeply magical. And it really reminds me a lot of like what I'm familiar with in like the Greek kind of Hellenistic philosophical side.
He was very steeped in Hellenistic and ancient sort of magic and philosophy, so he sort of blended a lot of that into what he was doing.
Right. And the cool thing too about Artaud is like our friend Ammon, Dr. Ammon, one of the things that he's looking for and he's interested in is this kind of mystic language, this poetic language that's presented through images, that's called the Orphic Vox, that was first described by a classicist by the name of Otto Kern. But this was how a lot of Hellenism was transmitted, or specifically Orphism, Orphic ideas, and Dionysian ideas were transmitted to the initiated through text, because they were always afraid that people would who weren't initiated would be seeing this stuff, or those who didn't have the words or the ears to hear, so a lot of this stuff would be coded in these classical images. So that's another aspect of these kind of dragons we're looking for, are people who kind of have this sort of approach where they're utilizing this kind of magical imagery, and are approaching it in the same way that Artaud is. And that brings us to today's poet, which is one of my favorite poets, and it's someone who gets kind of largely forgotten about. It's Kentuckian poet Madison Cawein. So have you ever, before I brought him up, had you ever even heard of Cawein before?
Was not familiar with his existence at all or his works.
Right. Most people aren't. Like, I actually only discovered him fairly recently, within the last like year or so, because like I'm a huge fan of when it comes to poetry. It's kind of funny because we're kind of opposites in some ways about what we look for in poetry. I love a lot of the musicality and the rhyme and that romanticism, the traditional stuff. And you really like a lot of that very dark, harsh,
visceral
minimalism, right? That breaks with form and challenges conception, you know? And I mean, don't get us wrong, we both appreciate the other side, right? But that's what you go for, and that's what I go for, you know? So like Madison Cawein is very much sort of a traditionalist. At least, you know, he was very much emulating the Victorian era poets of his day. Like he was a huge fan of people like Tennyson and Swinburne and you know, Keats, people like this, you know, and was constantly trying to, you know, write in this very poetic way about nature and about spirit. And what I found with Cawein was that, or Cawein, sorry, is that his poems were really widely available online. And I could just go through, like, he's so prolific. It's absolutely, like, it's almost borderline absurd. You know, he's composed 36 volumes of poetry or 1,500 unique poems. And, you know, a bunch of other republications as well as translations, because he spoke German as well as Latin and translated a lot of German poetry, specifically Goethe, as well as a German nature poet named Lindau into English. So it's just like, just incredible.
Masterfully prolific.
Right? Masterfully prolific. And he only lived a very short life as well. He only lived to be about 49 years old. It's kind of a crazy, you know, interesting character. But he largely gets forgotten because he's kind of one of these, you know, he comes up at the tail end of the Romantic era, just as Romanticism is kind of falling out of favor and modernism is kind of coming into fruition. And he kind of like hates modernism. We'll get into it. I got a couple of letters that he published. I was able to find this really amazing book called Story of a Poet by author Otto Rothert, who actually knew Cawein for a couple of years near the end of his life and wrote extensively on him and managed to assemble hundreds and hundreds of different letters from people that he knew or he wrote to or wrote to him. So really an amazing resource for checking this out. So we're fortunate here. So let's we're going to get into it here. I'll bring up here we go. My little presentation here. So here we have Madison Julius Cawein, you know, and this is near the end of his life in his late 40s. Here he is with his collection, you know, 36 tomes of poetry.
That's absolutely wild.
Yeah, and Madison Cawein is a Kentucky poet. He was really famous for writing in Kentucky and about the Kentucky landscape. They called him like the Keats of Kentucky, famously. You know, he's born in 1865 on March the 23rd. Here are his parents. So one of the interesting things that I look for when we're looking at these kind of dragon type characters, these truly magical artists, are what are their background? You know, where are they coming from? What are their influences? And his parents are both incredibly interesting people that I could do entire, you know, presentations on in their own rights. You know, so his father was William Cawein, who was a German immigrant. Originally, he was a chef and a cook, as well as a confectionery artist, making various pastries and whatnot. And he worked several different jobs doing that for his family. And his wife, Christiana or Annie Cawein, was a spiritualist medium. And yeah, so she was a famous spiritualist medium. She had her own kind of cult of followers. She even published a book of her seances. Was written by one of her followers, this guy Edward Shipton, but it's all based on what she gave forward. But
wow,
just kind of really wild upbringing. So we'll to start here, so this was a hotel that William Cawein, he went out about 20 miles from Louisville, and for a while, about 3 years, he was managing this hotel in this area called the Rock Springs. And at this time, Madison is about 9 years old. And this was like a really important time in his life, and he really remembered this place in Brownsboro County. And years later, he would come back here regularly to explore the wilderness. So the wilderness around here is like a huge part of his life. And what ends up happening is when they go out here to work at this hotel, unfortunately, Annie Cawein becomes quite ill, and they have to move back to the city. And his dad at that time decides to give up working in restaurants and in hotels and decides to become a herbalist, of all things. And he starts teaching himself herbalism, working with local indigenous people and reading all kinds of medical documents on his own and studying as well in Louisville, to the point where even though he doesn't go to university or college, they grant him a medical license because he's able to pass a series of tests. And him and Madison, him and all of his boys, he starts a herbal company where they will go out into these wilderness of Brownsboro County and collect herbs to create medicine. And he calls it William Cawein's Family Vegetable Medicine. Yeah, he has like several patented formulas at this time. And he became really well known because of two reasons. He didn't, unlike many herbalists in his day, he didn't sell like cure-alls or snake oils.
Yeah.
He would sell like very specific type things. And also because him and his boys picked the herbs themselves. They didn't have employees.
Right.
So, really interesting character, his dad. And he wrote this incredible, beautiful poem that I wanted to share with you guys about his father that really struck me. And it's very quintessential Cawein. It's a bit long, but it's rhymes, so it's going to be fun. But it goes. So this one is called One Who Loved Nature. And this was written as a eulogy to his father. He was not learned in any art, but nature led him by the hand and spoke her language to his heart so he could hear and understand. He loved her simply as a child, and in his love forgot the heat of conflict and sat reconciled in patience of defeat. Before me now I see him rise, a face that 70 years had snowed, with winter where the kind blue eyes like hospitable fires glowed. A small gray man whose heart was large and big with knowledge learned of need. A heart the hard world made its targe that never ceased to bleed. He knew all nature, yea, he knew what virtue lay within each flower, what tonic in the dawn and dew, and each root with magic power. What in the wild witch hazel trees reversed its time of blossoming and clothed its branches goldenly in fall instead of spring. He knew what made the firefly glow and pulse with crystal's gold and flame, and whence the bloodroot got its snow, and how the bramble's perfume came. He understood the water's word, and grasshoppers and crickets chirr, and of the music of each bird, he was the interpreter. He kept no calendar of days, but knew the seasons by the flowers. He could tell you by the rays of sun or stars the very hours. He probed the inner mysteries of light and knew the chemic change that colors flowers and what is their fragrances wild and strange. If some old oak had power of speech, it could not speak more wildwood lore, nor an experience further reach than he who was a tree at core. Nature was all his heritage and seemed to fill his every need. Her features were his book, whose page he never tired to read. He read her secrets that no man has ever read and never will, and put to scorn the charlatan who botanizes of her still. He kept his knowledge sweet and clean and questions not of why and what, and never drew a line between what's known and what is not. He was most gentle, good and wise, a simpler heart earth never saw. His soul looked softly from his eyes, and in his speech were love and awe. Yet nature in the end denied the thriving he had not asked for, fame. Unknown in poverty he died, and men forgot his name.
Wow, very evocative.
Right? Do you ever get a picture for the man, though? Right? I imagine just someone so deeply connected to the world and steeped in that nature. That's where he really felt himself, blossom, and someone who just gave his all to that medical craft. It's really beautiful. But also, there's a tinge of sadness, even though nature provided him with so much, love and support. It didn't give him fame, he didn't get to be remembered, at least outside of his kid. Pretty intense, eh?
That's a powerful poem. It's a very loving tribute.
Yeah, I loved it. And I wanted you guys just to see he had such a deep love for his parents. And in these relationships really were cornerstones of who he became, So next we're going to look more deeply at his mother, Christiana, or Annie Cawein. So this is the book that was written about her seances. It's called Woman and Her Relations to Humanity, Gleams of Celestial Light, the Genesis and Development of the Body, Soul, and Spirit, Moralizations of the Human Family.
Wow.
Yeah, so she wound up having like a core following of about 12 people. Specifically, there was this guy named Edward Shipton, who really was a devout follower of hers. And he decided to conduct a series of seances over the course of about 3 years with her and compile a book and have it published. And this is the book that they published together. So he wrote it all, but it's all based on her words, on things that she said.
Okay.
And this would have all happened around like 1879. So Madison is about 14 at this time. So very formative years of his life when they're doing these seances in his parents' house and his mom's being treated like she's speaking to these powerful spirits. And the book consists of about 3 different spirits that she talks to. And there's really interesting here. So one of them is this character named Benjamin Haman. And this is a friend of Annie and one of her followers painted Ben based on what she had said. And Benjamin was said to be a Muslim mystic, who had died in the 4th century.
Wow.
And he narrates much of the book, but there's also 2 other spirits who narrate and give interesting stories. Another Muslim mystic named Ariosta, I believe, Ariosta Bey. And then someone we'll all recognize, but the famous Chinese sage Confucius makes an appearance in the book. And it's interesting is they all kind of talk about Christ as this. She has this interesting kind of, in some ways, pro-Christian, in other ways, anti-Christian view. She believes in reincarnation, anti-materialism, in a personal deity. And in this, but she also believes kind of Christ is along the same, he's a universal teacher, one of these universal masters who's part of a long lineage of special gurus, stuff you see in a lot of spiritualism and theosophy of this time. It's so right around this time in the 1800s, there is kind of this revival of spiritism. And this is very common for people to have public seances and to talk about these alternative religions. And they're extraordinarily popular among, minority groups, and specifically with women, because a lot of women become key figures within the spiritualist movement and become publishers in their own right, like Helena Blavatsky, for example, and others. And it also becomes a major component of women's suffrage in both the UK and in the US at this time. So it's very progressive, interesting kind of religious movement that's largely been forgotten, but had long-lasting effects. Much of this has now evolved into what we call the New Age or modern paganism,
Right.
So yeah, that's Benjamin Haman. And I wanted to read a couple passages from this book, so just we get a taste for what it's about. But do you have any thoughts or anything so far? What do you think about the spiritualism and the potential cult?
I think it's fascinating to have that type of a figure being like your role model in your life at like such a young age would be very defining.
Right? And you gotta remember, like, this is a time when like most people are extraordinary Christian, and he's in the South. It's a deeply racist time, and his mom is talking about summoning Confucius, and
Yeah, I
talking to
can't
her about
imagine
the
how that
truth
would
of
have.
Christ. You know,
Can't
so
imagine how that would have flown with some people.
right, right, so radical. Just it's really interesting, and actually that colors a lot of Cawein. He's very or Cawein, sorry. He is very reluctant to talk about a lot of his own spiritual stuff, even though it's very prevalent in his poetry and personal discourse and letters. He's very reticent. But I wanted to read a couple passages from the Annie Cawein's book.
Of
So
course.
this one I really liked. This was right at the beginning, and this is a line that's spoken by Benjamin Haman. It says, "Our aim is to contend against the all-enveloping, pervading materialism of those who, grown in error and enmity to God, deny the existence of a personal God, yet secretly, in superstitious fear, worship at the shrine of some dreadful image, and receive for it all power and esteem of their fellows for their self-aggrandizement. We want your cooperation against that hidden form of materialism indulged in by those who vaunt the proud name of Christian and apparently worship at its shrine." So pretty condemning, Benjamin Haman.
Yeah, a little bit scathing, a little bit
You know, the modern
antagonistic.
Christians are too materialistic, you know. But this is interesting because materialism and is kind of an issue for Cawein throughout his life, as we'll later come to see. But here's another quote that I thought was really profound, and this one is spoken by Ariosto. It says, "What is life but spirit? The outgrowth of the supreme intelligence, extending from the spheres beyond, drawing from the fountain of life the deified attributes of the great fountain of life. Every plant, every flower, every shrub will prove to you that reincarnation is a truth. In the first formation of this globe, when all was a vast desert of water, rock, and soil, when vegetation first developed itself, how many thousand years of repetition until the stately oak was developed from a sprig of moss? Then, through these various changes, after the oak tree had spread its branches and the fig tree had borne its fruit, how many thousand other years before a human hand had planted a seed or gathered in the fruits of the soil?"
Wow. So you really see his you can see where he gets this concept of like spirit and nature from. It's like very entrenched in his parents, you know?
Very deeply entrenched in his parents. Like his parents are steeped in this pantheism, in nature worship. Like we don't have any writings from his father, but his father is just a nature wanderer. He spends all his time gathering herbs, and then his
Yeah.
mother is writing this intensely deep philosophical poetic seance stuff. It's so amazing, you know, really interesting. And like it's you could tell that at this time, like you can tell she's a very learned person, because you could see like there's a reaction to evolution and other things that would have been at that time fairly not novel, but not generally accepted by the average person, so
Definitely.
really, really interesting. Okay, so I wanted to talk just a little bit about Cawein and his religious thought, just because it's such a part of our channel and what we talk about. And Otto Rothart was really interested. A lot of people were deeply interested in this idea because Cawein had at this time, it was seen as a notorious background. His parents were German immigrants one is a spiritualist cult leader and the other is potentially a snake doctor. At least that's how, like in some of the stuff I was reading, how people viewed them, which is a shame. So people were deeply interested in what Cawein actually thought. And he was very, like I said, was very reticent. But this is what Rothert, who wrote the autobiography and knew Cawein, said. So he says that Cawein was a pantheist, is apparent in many of his poems. The day he presented me with a copy of Woman and Her Relations to Humanity, he gave me a brief history of his mother's connection with the book. In answer to my question as to whether or not he, like his mother, was a spiritualist, he then said in substance, I am what might be called a believer in spiritualism, and have been for many years, but I have never practiced it nor seriously tried to investigate it. I believe in a hereafter, and that the soul retains its identity, and that then, as now, it forms a part of the great whole. My mother here herself could not account for nor explain her power as a medium, nor could anyone else who tried to do so. All I know and all she knew was that when in a trance, she transmitted messages from the departed to the living. I sometimes believe we are controlled more by the departed than by living. On another occasion, he told me, as he had told others before, that he believed in fairies and spirits. In answer to my question whether or not he had ever seen fairies or ghosts, he hesitated a moment and said that he had not. So this is interesting because you see him on one hand, like he believes in spirits and has this deep spiritual connection, and he professes to believe in spiritualism, but then doesn't investigate it, doesn't pursue it like his mother surely did. But you also see, like, he goes beyond just pantheism. He says a great whole. To me, that screams of monism, right? To me, that screams of monism. This is a very deep spiritual thinker. And again, I wonder how open he was willing to be with Otto, So it's interesting to think about, because there are other letters from people who say that he was a staunch, like, rationalist, and didn't believe in spiritualism. But I think he probably did believe in these things, but he believed it in a very philosophical way. And he trusted his reason above everything. Like, he wasn't willing to say he saw spirits, even though he believes in them. To me, that screams a person who is very trustworthy in a sense, very honest to themselves,
Definitely.
It's interesting. So at one point he did a questionnaire, and he was asked this question directly. And this is the personal answer he gives about religion. So the question from the questionnaire I found, this was published in a Louisville newspaper, was, what of religion? Has it touched your life? What of history, philosophy, science, travel, friendship? Also love and loves, law and politics? And Cawein answers, religion, as expounded by the modern preacher from the pulpit, has never touched me. The pathos of the life and death of Christ, as described in the Bible, has moved me to tears. I do not believe Christ to have been the Son of God, nor immaculately conceived. He was a wonderful man, and one who was beautiful in his life and most noble in his death. I feel cold when it comes to religion because the world does not seem to have been benefited by Christianity. Although pretending to believe in the teachings of Christ, the world remains skeptical and barbarian, as the ages that preceded Christ's teachings were. Pretty condemning of Christianity, And I wonder if he actually felt that way about Jesus. We'll never truly know. His mother seemed to be a fairly devout Christian, but she seemed to believe that modern Christians had totally lied and misconstrued Jesus, So,
right.
And then
I
what he
feel
said,
like being in the South, saying that you don't believe that Christ is the Son of God would draw a lot of negative attention towards you.
Right? Like, we got to remember, right? This is still like 1880s. And he's like, yeah, I don't believe in God. Jesus is God, right? Like, whoa, okay. Gotta love it. So here's what he has to say about history and everything else. It says, I've read and enjoyed history, the history of my country, that of Europe and Asia. I've read many histories, the history of the world by John Redpath, whom I knew personally, Gibbon's history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. I have only traveled in the United States, never abroad. My friendships have been many, but mostly among men, Women seem to be afraid of a poet. I doubt that. I think that
Yeah.
women back then were less likely to have male friendships in general. Those were discouraged. So, you know,
Yeah.
I may have had several love affairs, or I have had several love affairs, some of a more or less shadowy nature, but one supreme one alone. With her I married, Gertrude Foster McKelvey, who became my wife June 4th, 1903. We have one child, Preston Hamilton Cawein, born March 18, 1904. And he has no interest in politics, you know. Very much a man of his time in that way, you know. A lot of working class people of his roots would not be talking politics, you know. Just,
No, and it seems like he may have a personal philosophy that goes beyond sort of political faction, you know, kind of like Artaud in a sense.
right. I mean, going through a lot of his letters and whatnot, he still is very much a man of his day. I wouldn't call him a racist, but he is weary of other groups, and there is a cultural bias there. He's far more open than a lot of people of like his contemporaries, but by our means, he's by no means a progressive, you know.
Right.
So here he is at age. This is a picture of him, age 22. Right? This is right when he publishes his first book of poetry. But connected to it, I included his first poem that he ever published. And this was, they found this, it wasn't actually published under his own name. It was under a pseudonym because he would send out as a young man poems all over the place. And we estimate he was about 20, or they estimate 20 or 19 when this was published. And it's called Lightning Over the Ohio. It says, now night in purple pall, all dusty with white stars, through heaven's moonlit hall, in pensive state her solemn march begins. Within the western summer sky, where turns you lonely orb, a flame, a splash of fire, a crystal bud, its petals white expanding, the atmosphere domed, bubble, clouds, thick spins, of grotesque shapes that form and die, moon flooded with a pearly garb, grow a stately mosque with spire on spire, in which aerial sylphs their worship make. And there within those halls of vapor formed, the dumb white lightning dance, as if soul of day with fair night charmed. Send forth swift glance on glance. Thus seem the speechless lightning in the night, when summer stamps the earth, with mellow winds that bring spring's delight into fruitful birth, to pulse within the dark blue skies, where crystal mountain clouds arise, in solemn state cathedral wise, beneath the dome of stars, through which the astral sheltered night in moon-wheeled car swift takes her flight, with swarthy wand and dark bed light, and rules the dome of stars. I mean, I could never write something like that at 20. Right?
Yeah.
Just absolutely incredible, you know. And going through that book about his early life, the story of a poet by his friend Otto, they talk about how very early on he became like a poetry drunkie. At 9 years old, he read The Raven and he became obsessed. He spent all of his free time tracking down books. He'd go to the public library, he'd go to various churches of all the different denominations, and just go and read their books.
Wow.
You know, and when he was in school, he was quickly recognized for these talents, and he was celebrated as such. And he had a couple of teachers who really promoted him and told him to pursue this goal. You know, so
It's great that he had encouragement from people in his life, you know?
Yeah, it's amazing. And he you know, this is a working class fellow whose parents couldn't give him support, and he managed to pay his way into university through working part-time. You know, his brothers ran a pool hall, and they would do betting on horse races, and he worked for them as a cashier for several years. And He published poetry all at this time and saved up money. And then by the time he was 22, he independently published his own book of poetry. And it's called The Blooms of the Berry, And so he's 22 years old, right? And this book is 600 pages long.
Wow.
Massive tome of like basically everything he had written at that time. He wound up regretting this book and tried to like have it burned later in life and buy up all the copies. It's kind of hilarious. But so here's one of the books from it here's one of the poems from the book that stood out to me. It's called Ghosts. In soft sad nights, when all the still lagoon lulls in a wealth of golden radiance, I sit like one enchanted in a trance and see them twixt the haunted mist and moon. Lascivious eyes, neath snow-pale sensual brows, flashing hot, killing lust in tresses light. Loose, satin streaming, purple as the night. Night when the storm sings in the forest boughs, and then meseems along the wild, fierce hills, a whisper and a rustle of fleet feet, as if tempestuous troops of maenads meet to drain deep bowels and shout and have their will.
Wow.
And we all know what the maenads do. They rip people apart and devour their flesh in ecstatic bliss.
Yes.
So pretty powerful stuff. I absolutely loved it. And this book, when he released it at 22, it caused like a huge splash. He wound up getting like accolades from a bunch of prominent authors in the time. He got celebrated in Kentucky and became very, very popular, kind of like an overnight sensation.
Wow.
And so he quickly starts publishing a bunch of poetry. He develops this really like rigorous work style where, so here's just to show some things. This is the pool hall that he worked at with his brothers as a cashier, checking horse race gambling tickets on the left. And then on the right, this is his parents' home. And he lived with his parents until his mid-30s because he was determined to be an independent poet. And like he saved up all of his money and he spent all of his time. Like he had such a rigorous work ethic. He'd wake up at 6 a.m, go out and see the dawn, like rise with the dawn. He would do like doodles and sketches and stuff. And then he'd go for a nature walk. And then by the afternoon, he'd come home and he'd write all afternoon. And then in the evenings, he'd go to the bar and he'd work the cashier bar all night long, taking checks for all the horse races into the night.
It's quite the life.
And he did this for several years as a single man until, like he said, he met Gertrude, who was a musician, and she was playing in various bars downtown and stuff. And they fell in love and got married. And at that time, when they got married, he started to become even more successful. So he starts to become very, very celebrated in Kentucky. And he publishes a bunch of books that all sell well. He has well, before we get into that, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. He's like, at this time when he's doing his most prolific writing, I wanted to talk about like where he's going around in nature. He's like very dedicated to the area of Kentucky he's from, around Louisville and Brownsboro County. And every day he goes to Louisville Park and he would go to a lot of the same spots. So this is a modern picture of one of the spots he would go to. It's called Babbitt's Creek. And
gorgeous.
This place, like he talks about in his writings, haunts of Pan, or places where the satyrs play. And he always wanted to go to these places in the early morning to watch the satyrs dance, he says. And he would draw their dancing and this would inspire his poems. So this is one of the places, Babbitt's Creek. This was a pond. It was called Old Frog Pond. And it was near there are these hills by his parents' old house that he used to frequent. And this was in between the two hills. his most favorite place was here. It's at this spot called, you can still go here to this day. And there's actually a walk, a paved walk called Cawein's Walk that he used to take every single day in Iroquois Park. And they made this big spot lookout, but he used to sit at that very lookout and he'd look over this place they called the Bull. And it's like this massive dip where apparently native people used to go down there and do powwows and do their some ceremonies because it would echo. And he felt like this was the quintessential haunt of Pan, you know? And this is where most of his poetry was written, sitting, you know, this paved ledge wouldn't have been there. It would have just been a hill in his day, you know? So,
wow.
Yeah. And he would always talk about the fairies, and we'll get into some of his poems later, and there's some really beautiful stuff. But yeah, so here he is with his wife Gertrude and their son Preston. And when he had Preston, he also started to write children's literature a lot of fairy stories. And he was really interesting because he would combine his adult and children's literature. And when asked about this, he would say everything was always written for Preston, and anything that appeared adult was just, you know, our misconceptions. You know, and you know, so at this time he had like he gets married. They buy this really amazing house, you know, right in downtown Louisville, and this is where the materialism, unfortunately, starts to come to bite Cawein. So his tale is both beautiful and kind of tragic. So he comes up out of the Romantic period as someone who is a devout lover of Percy Shelley, of Tennyson, of John Keats, and he emulates those poets and he achieves success early on. But at the time of his middle age, when he has his child, the world is moving on from Romanticism, you know, and you're starting to see the birth of modernism. You know, people like Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot and others are coming up at this time, and they're starting to create what's considered like the quintessential American poetry. You know, it's really important for people at this time in the U.S. to come up with their own distinct style, something that's removed from the English tradition. Whereas Cawein is very much invested in both the English and German traditions. You know, he refuses to give them up. He's a traditionalist at heart. He doesn't want to stop talking about spirits in nature. You know, he doesn't want to give up the rhyme. You know, everything's got to be a song and dance for him. To him, that's the beauty. And it comes to hurt him, you know, and also he has this deep appreciations of aesthetics, him and his wife. They love to go to the theater. They love to eat. They get a massive library, you know, and Cawein becomes like a stock day trader at this time too, and starts to gamble on the stock market. And he has some early successes, but later on in his life, it becomes very problematic for him, unfortunately. So let's keep going here. So I wanted to read some of his letters. So, sure. You know, Cawein was a very prolific letter writer, but unfortunately, he was a very private person. And when he got ill, he burned a lot of his letters, and he had his wife destroy a lot of his writings. So a lot of the letters that his friend Otto Rothert found were actually held by other people. So there were letters he wrote to people, not so much letters that were written to him, you know. Right. But we do have a lot of correspondence he made with certain friends and with poetry magazines. And I wanted to show you just his hatred for modernism and his response to the changing scenery of poetry at this time. So he's writing this to a publisher of a famous poetry magazine. It says, Miss Harriet Monroe, Neihart's Death of Agrippina in the main number of your magazine, Poetry, a Magazine of Verse, is the best thing you have published so far, in my opinion. The less of that Ezra Pound stuff you put in your pages, the better it will be for the future of poetry. Walt Whitman gone mad, without the grace and sound common sense of Whitman to redeem the platitude and lack of poetic form and inspiration. A boy could write such stuff by the yard without any mental effort whatever. May God help us who love real poetry if this is the kind of verse we are to be doomed to read in the next decade. I don't think Cawein would have been happy with the next decade.
No.
Because, freedom from tradition only amplifies. And I think, I love traditional poetry and rhyme and verse, but, you cannot put confines on creativity, Mr. Cawein. Come on.
I mean, on the one hand, I admire his dedication to his style. On the other hand, I can see how it could end up and being malconforming and harmful for him.
You know what? It's one of these things where I always think too, like thinking about the philosophy of like paganism and Hellenism and all this stuff. This idea of the embracing of change and learning to adapt and to go with the flow is such an essential theme. And we see Cawein refusing to do that. Like the idea is you're supposed to go to the past for inspiration, but you're supposed to transform it into something new in the present.
Right.
He does start to do that near the end of his life, but sadly, it's a little too late for Cawein. We'll continue here. I wanted to read another one of his letters on modernism, just because it's funny. Again, to Miss Harriet Monroe. I return, as you requested, the clipping from the Chicago Post. Floyd Dell, the editor, whose verses I have seen occasionally, is just the man to admire Ezra Pound's work. He is young, too, and full of fire, desirous of smashing precedents in poetry, as well as poets themselves of established reputations. I have seen some of his sledgehammer reviews of such poets. Time will work the whole matter out justly, I think. It did, and he lost. I'm very willing to trust its judgment. I cannot bring my poetical faculties into sympathy with that kind of work, nor with this new poets from India that everybody is praising. He's talking about Tagore. Praising now, nor with several others whose work is more like prose than poetry. That poets, for instance, whose long poem, The Green Cage, appears in the June Atlantic. Though I must admit the thoughts are startling and often the wording is beautiful, I still maintain that form and rhythm and music are absolutely necessary to the making of good poetry. Yours cordially, Madison Cawein. You see, like, he's of the most pretentious of pretentious, for someone who comes from such like deep working class roots. It's a bit shocking, but it's interesting,
Yeah, interesting seeing his passion for form and tradition.
Right, but it really starts to come to haunt him. So what ends up happening is, like, this letter is written in 1913. Well, in 1910 to about 1912, there's kind of like a stock market crash that happens in the US at this time. And it's due to the American government breaking up Standard Oil and several other monopolies, And what ends up happening is the stock market takes like a plunge of about almost 30% at this time. Wow. So Cawein was kind of notorious for living paycheck to paycheck and living this affluent, very aesthetic lifestyle. And he just went belly up, overnight. He loses almost everything. And he has to sell his books and he has to sell his house, and he loses out on a bunch of major opportunities. So this is a letter he wrote to a friend about a potential trip they were going to plan to Greece. It says, I wish I could have been with you in Greece, in the Vale of Tempe at any rate. It must have been perfect, but I suppose I shall never go abroad. Things are not favorable. Finances go from bad to worse, and poetry brings nothing in, a few dollars at most. It is true publishers publish my books, some of them, at their own expense, but the return in royalties amount to very little indeed. I suppose I am fortunate to find a publisher and ought to be satisfied. But a poet has to live the same as a bricklayer, you know. I agree with you entirely as to the poetry that is finding most favor in this country at the present time. Enterprise or progress seems to be the subject matter of most of the poetry written now. Hardly that now either more attention is being paid to the prostitute and the white slave. Little music or beauty in any of it. In any of it. Whoa.
Wow.
You know,
And
so
he's not wrong about poetry not really bringing in the dollars, It's never
no,
really it's never really been like a profitable enterprise. It's really more of a thing of passion.
right, right. And it's also it's one of these things where it's like he's not wrong either about modernism. Modernism does focus on atrocities and it doesn't. It talks about the death of nature if it addresses nature. It does talk about people under oppression. I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing, Mr. Cawein, but
No.
it is what it is, right? But this is part of the story here, right? This is a man who gambled on the stock market and refused to progress, and it really hurt him. So this is just him talking about having to sell his books. So he managed to get like $50 for a signed book of his son's, and just how desperate of straits that he went in. In a few years, he goes from this affluent, celebrated poet to just completely destitute.
Yeah.
And this is one of the last letters that he wrote before he died, just to show you how dark it got. It says, "It is almost impossible to collect money or to borrow it. Several periodicals owe me money, but they will not send me checks. I may be able to borrow some money on my house, but so far the banks are loath to make loans on real estate. The war has done it, and I look worse for times this winter." He wouldn't survive the winter. He
Wow.
passed away in December 8th of 1914 of that year.
Oddly prophetic.
Yeah. And his last known residence was this apartment complex here. He was in the top right side apartment that we can see there.
Okay.
And he was said to have died of apoplectic shock, and a lot of people speculate it was probably a combination of depression and malnutrition. It was said in his letters he was going out without food to feed his wife and his son.
Wow.
And they were living in the cold, and just really, really depressing to see someone go from the absolute heights to the absolute rock bottom.
Yeah.
This is his death mask at 49. And the grave site of him and his wife Gertrude, and after he passed away, Preston changed his name to Madison Cawein Jr. and wrote several poems, and then became a doctor in his own right.
Wow.
And the Caweins are still fairly prominent, and there are many of them have gone on to be prominent figures in Louisville. There was even one that was connected to I was searching around and I found one was connected to a murder. So there's some interesting stuff in his later relatives, but yeah, really kind of a mixed story, On one hand, he's this incredible magical genius who took the world by storm at a very young age, but was unable to stay with the times, He was such a romantic and so in love with the past and this image of the world, and his world was radically changing and he refused to move with it,
Right. And some maybe reckless decisions as well, monetarily.
Yeah. Playing the stock market, it's interesting, because gambling is such a feature of his life, right? He works as a cashier, and then is the stock market in my mind is gambling,
Essentially.
Right. But this was one of the last books he published, and was probably his most celebrated, his most famous. It was a book of children's poetry, but in very much a Cawein style, It's not very childlike. Called Minions of the Moon. And yeah, I love the art there. And there's some other pictures from inside that were really great of Cawein with his fairies.
Wow.
So just
beautiful imagery.
Yeah. So just to end it out, you don't mind if I read some of my favorite poems of his, and then we can talk about them? So I wanted to, because our channel focuses a lot on spirituality, I wanted to kind of single out some of those poems. So this one is called Deity, and he wrote this at his poetic heights when he's being highly celebrated, so in the 1880s or so. It says, Deity, no personal, a god divinely crowned, with gold and raised upon golden throne, deep in golden glory, whence he nods, man this or that and little more than man. And shalt thou see him individual? Not till the freed intelligence has sought 100 years to rise in love, piercing the singing cycles under God, their iridescent evolutions orbed in wild prismatic splendors. Shall it see through God propinquity become a god? See, lightning out of spheric harmonies, resplendent seas of empyrean light, prisms and facets of 10 million beams, starry, a crystal of berrain-bowed rays, and in this eyes of burning sapphire, eyes deep as the music of the beautiful, and over the eyes, limpid, hierarchical brows, as they were lilies of seraphic fire, lips underneath of trembling ruby lips, whose tongues accord, and every sound a song, cherubic faces of intensity, in multiplying myriads to a word, forming the unit, God's supremacy, creative and ubiquitous. From this, thy intellect, detached, expelled and breathed, exultant into flesh endowed with soul, one sparkle of the essence clothed with clay, O high development, devolvings up from matter to unmattered potencies, up to the source and fountain of all mind, beauty and truth, inviolable love, and so resumed and reabsorbed in God, one more expression of eternity. Pretty intense, eh?
It's powerful. I like that. No, not that I like, but it's interesting to note that he didn't really rely on rhyming scheme in this poem at all. He sort of just he has that classical form still, but he's playing around a little bit more with the language.
Yeah, not all of his poems are rhymes, but they all have a musical flow,
Yes.
Right?
And
they all lend
definitely
themselves to
that.
cadence. Yeah. What's really wild about this poem and why I selected it, and people who are really into Hellenism will notice, is the Platonic language, right? He's talking about God as the high intellect, as this Platonic ideal. And he talks about the everlasting soul and how that is akin to God, and he's basically describing the cycle of death and rebirth. This is Neoplatonism at its finest in poetic imagery. It's wonderful. It's like I'm trying to point out some of the parts that really are just thy intellect detached, expelled, then breathed, exultant into flesh, endowed with soul. That's evocative of the biblical imagery, but it's also this play on the dust and the breathing of life, like one sparkle of the essence clothed with clay, like he's reminding us that our essence, right, is akin to God, and we are just clothed in the dust, right? We are still akin to God, so it's taking this Christian imagery and it's making it Neoplatonic. And I absolutely love it. And also this no personal, a God divinely crowned,
That line. A very bold opening to the poem.
Right? With gold raised upon a golden throne. Like he is evoking that high heavenly deity. Like in Hellenism, this would be Urania, Aphrodite Urania, versus Aphrodite Pandemos, Aphrodite of the heavens versus Aphrodite for all, you know? And they were seen as mirrors of each other, you know, but to get to the one, you have to go to the other first. And you see that here, right? From our body, from the struggles of the matter, we're able to experience this divine. So he says no personal, but then he contradicts himself later.
Yes.
You know, in the experience. Like, isn't that kind of interesting?
Very.
Yeah, just a lot of fun. So that was deity. Here's another one. I've shared this on my channel, and this was one that he wrote near the end of his life when he's in his deep depression, you know, just before he dies. This comes out in his last recorded book, Minions of the Moon. So here's a tale for infants and old nurses. There was a man who gathered rags and peddled, who lived alone with no one ever meddled. And this old man was very fond of verses, his house a ruin, so the tale rehearses. A hovel overrun of rats and vermin, not fit for beasts to live in, like a sermon, embodying misery and hell and curses. There, one gray dawn of rain and windy weather, they found him dead, starved over a written paper, beside a dim and half-expiring taper. It was a play, the poor fool put together, of gnomes and fairies, for his own sad pleasure, and folks destroyed it, saying, "We seek for treasure."
See, that speaks to me.
Right? You pour your life, like some people hear those rhymes and they think it's this silly children's thing, but to him, these fairy stories, these rhymes are everything.
He's speaking of desperation, of poverty, you know, of the desire to latch on to that beauty, that magic in life, and then to have someone at the end look at it and say, this isn't what we need, or this isn't what we want, you know?
And just the complete misconstructions of treasure. To the old man, the stories of gnomes and fairies are his treasure. Exactly. They are his gold. And then the people, they just destroy it without even noticing. They never see the gold.
They're oblivious to the magic.
Yeah. And this is how he must have felt about his art, you know? And I'm just happy that we can look back on it, you know, at this time now, and we can give him the celebration he deserves, in my opinion.
Definitely.
You know? Because there is, you know, there is power in the simplicity. There's power in the childishness, in the fancy, and in the delight, you know? A lot of the criticism for Cawein, I don't see as like the things people criticize him for, I love him for, you know? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of art, and, you know, and any form of art is it's very subjective.
Yeah.
One man, what one person sees nothing in, another person can see everything in, right?
Exactly. That's our fractal nature of reality too, you know? We can all find beauty. So here's one that I found had like really deep kind of Saturnian imagery that was very kind of dark and intense. It's called Heart's Encouragement. Nor time, nor all his minions, of sorrow or of pain, shall dash with vultured pinions the cup she fills again, within the dream dominions of life where she doth reign. Clothed on with bright desire, and hope that makes her strong, with limbs of frost and fire, she sits above all wrong. Her heart a living lyre, her love its only song. And in the waking pauses of weariness and care, when the dark hour draws his black weapon of despair, and above effects and causes, we hear its music there. The longings life hath near it, of love we yearn to see it. The dreams it doth inherit of immortality are callings of her spirit to something yet to be.
Wow. Draws his black weapon of despair. I love that line.
Right? Right? And there's just like, to me, who's someone who's really interested in this goddess imagery and the Saturn imagery, immediately I jump on to talk of time, and the
Yeah.
sorrow and the pain and also the love, right? This imagery of the cup that is filled, right? Clothed on with bright desire. To me, that is evocative of the book of Revelation. She who is clothed in sunlight, the Virgin Mary, right?
Yes.
It's really beautiful. And yeah, like it's about, again, it's this, to me, this really is evocative of sort of that the Greek tradition of affirmation. A lot of Greek poetry and Greek theater was all about that affirming of life, um, engaging with the struggle against time, going through death, facing it head on, and coming out the other side, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I got. It's this encouragement to face the sorrows of time and persist, and to focus on the beautiful side, the love, right? Anyway, super neat.
Yeah, it's a beautiful piece.
So this one I wanted to share because it's filled with a lot of the Orphic imagery, that Orphic vox that Ammon is always talking about. And so those of you with ears to hear, open your ears up and pay attention, because you may see something that even I miss. So the purple valleys, far in the purple valleys of illusion, I see her waiting like the soul of music, with deep eyes lovelier than cerulean pansies, shadow of fire, yet merciless as poison, with red lips sweeter than Arabian storax, yet bitterer than myrrh. O tears and kisses, O eyes and lips that haunt my soul forever. Again spring walks, transcendent on the mountains. The woods are hushed, the vales are blue with shadows. Above the heights steeped in 1,000 splendors, like some vast canvas of the gods hangs burning. The sunset's wild seagraphy, and slowly the moon treads heaven's proscenium, night stately. White queen of love and tragedy and madness, again I know forgotten dreams and longings, ideals lost, desires dead and buried. Beside the altar, sacrifice erected, within the heart's high sanctuary strangely. Again I know the horror of the rapture. Sorry guys. Again I know the horror of the rapture, the utterless awe, the joy akin to anguish, the terror and the worship of the spirit. Again I feel her eyes pierce through and through me, her deep eyes lovelier than imperial pansies, velvet and flame, through which her fierce will holds me, powerless and tame, and draws me on and onward to sad, unsatisfied, and animal yearnings, wild, unrestrained, the brute within the human, to fling me panting on her mouth and bosom. Again I feel her lips, like ice and fire, her red lips, odorous as Arabian storax, fragrance and fire within, whose kiss destruction lies serpent-like, intoxicating languors, resistingly embrace me, soul and body, and we go drifting, drifting she is laughing, outcasts of God, into the deep's abysm.
Wow. There's a
Right?
lot there. There's a lot to unpack.
There's so much to unpack. Again, for those with ears to hear, do you see Lady Babylon? Her with the red lips, who, think about the imagery of Circe, who turns men into pigs, who has her way with them, who reduces men to satyrs. Remember, a satyr is a state of madness induced by drugs that causes men to have an uncontrollable erection. They
Yeah.
run around in frenzy. This is Cawein being turned into a satyr through the lust and power of Lady Babylon.
Wow.
All of the drugs are there. It's all there. The storax, which is a herb to Saturn, the myrrh, that's another herb. We're dealing with a lot of this The cerulean pansies, there's drugs in here, my friends. Purple valleys of illusion. What's going on? But yeah, let's continue. So this is one that's kind of notorious. It generated a fair amount of controversy in his time, called Orgy. It's actually one of the ones that people still talk about because of its provocative imagery. He has another one that's similar called Vampire. I didn't include it just because it was running out of things, but if you're looking for more dark Cawein, check out Vampire. But let's read Orgy. You know, and again, this is an orgy in the mystery sense, okay? On nights like this, when bayou and lagoon dream in the moonlight's mystic radiance, I seem to walk like one deep in a trance, with old world myths born of the mist and moon. Lascivious eyes and mouths of sensual rose smile into mine, and breasts of luring light, and tresses streaming golden into the night, persuade me onward where the forest glows. And then it seems along the haunted hills there falls a flutter as of beautiful feet, as if tempestuous troops of maenads meet, to drain deep bowls and shout and have their wills. And then I see her limbs will be revealed like some great snow-white moth among the trees, her vampire beauty, waiting there to seize and dance me downward where my doom is sealed. Again, it's this imagery of the sacrifice, of being destroyed by that loving embrace of the goddess, you know?
Yeah, so you mentioned the maenads again here.
Right? There's an ongoing theme of Lady Babylon, the maenads, of wanting to be ripped apart, of wanting to be Orpheus, you know? This is some deep, profound stuff here, you know?
And in one of the previous poems you read, he mentions tragedy too, which is like the quintessential tale of ripping apart, and
Exactly, right? It's the goat song, you know? And again, the tragedy is that affirmation of life, right? That's the point, to face the cruelties, that which despises us, that which causes us fear, you know? And by facing and engaging with those fears, they're no longer as powerful, you know? We can contextualize them, we can diminish them, you know? I think about it like you see someone jump off a cliff, then all of a sudden you can jump off the cliff, you know? Right? Or I think about it in my own life. My dad was talking to me about this. Recently, we went back and we watched The Exorcist, okay? And that movie is not good. It's just child abuse. It's just an hour and a half of child abuse, and it's awful, and it's not scary, and it's stupid. But and both my dad and I saw this movie. We're like, how, this is the scariest movie of all time. What is going on? What is going on? But my dad is telling me when I was a kid and I'm, 16 and in the movie theater seeing this as a young person raised in Catholicism, this was all of my nightmares brought to life. And it was only once they were put on the screen that I could take the piss out of them. And now 10 years later, I can look at it and go, wait, it really is just child abuse. This is kind of stupid,
Yeah.
That's the point of these kind of horror, this tragedy. It allows us to face it, We have to engage the imagination, not hide from it. Just my little rant. So since it's the hallowed season, I wanted to read one of his children's kind of rhymes for Halloween. This was called Hallow Mass. I'm just going to make it big here for myself. One sec. Okay. All right. So, all hushed of glee, the last chill bee clings wearily to the dying aster. The leaves drop faster, and all around red as disaster. The forest crimson with tree on tree. A butterfly, the last to die, wings heavily by, weighed down with torpor. The air grows sharper, and the wind in the trees, like some sad harper, sits and sorrows with sigh on sigh. The far crow calls. The acorns fall, And over all the autumn raises dun mists and hazes, through which her soul it seemeth gazes on ghosts and dreams in carnival. The end is near. The dying year leans low to hear her own heart breaking, and beauty taking her flight, and all my dreams forsaking. My soul bowed down mid the sad and sear. Pretty fun, eh? And
Yeah.
pretty evocative of autumn and ghosts and Halloween. I thought that was
It's so
very,
fitting. It's perfect.
so picturesque. I just loved it. Something simple, but just puts a smile on my face, like pumpkin spice, right? And I wanted to read just some of his more child fairy stuff, just so that we get the full extent of his fancy. And then we'll end with a couple of his more dark poems from his end of his life. So this is kind of like one of my favorite of his fairy poems. It's called Fairy Cavalier. By a mushroom in the moon, white as bud from budded berry, silver buckles on my shoon. Ho, the moon shines merry. Here I sit and drink my grog, stocks and tunic oofen yellow, skinned from belly of a frog, quite a fine, fierce fellow. My good cloak a bat's wing gave, and a beetle's wing my bonnet, and a moth's head grew the brave, gallant feather on it. Faith, I have rich jewels rare, rings and carcanets, all studded, thick with spiders' eyes that glare, like great rubies blooded. And I swear, sirs, by my blade, sirrah, a good stabbing hanger, from a hornet stinger made, when I am in anger. Fill the lichen, pottles up, honey pressed from hearts of roses, cheek by jowl, up with each cup, till we hide our noses. Good sirs, marry, 'tis the cock. Hey away, the moon's lost fire. Ho, the cock, our dial and clock. Hide we neath this briar. Pretty cute, eh?
He has so much fun with language. You can tell that he's just in delight when he writes these.
Right? And I got this image of this little gnome who's decking himself out with his sword and his hat and his cloak and jumping around on mushrooms.
Tripping his grog.
This is a Brian Froud painting brought to poetic form, So I love it. So let's keep going here. So this is probably his most famous poem. This is called Wasteland. So this is the poem that in the 90s, there was a Canadian scholar, forgetting the name, but he was doing deep analysis of poetry, and he noticed deep similarities in the language and the imagery in this Wasteland and in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Now, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland is one of the most famous poems ever written. And I'm not suggesting that it was plagiarism outright. I don't really believe in plagiarism. I believe that we're all kind of engaging in this shared creative process with the muse, and we're all building upon each other, and I think Cawein would have felt the same, because so much of his poetry is reminiscent of all of these great traditionalists. So I don't think he would have felt bad about T.S. Eliot taking his imagery and remixing it, especially because he abandons all of the form that Cawein so defines himself by. What he keeps is that scariness about the death of nature and that uncertainty, about the changing natural landscape and our changing relationship to the natural world, So I'm going to read this poem, and you can see this was Cawein's response to modernism. He wrote this at the end of his life. It appeared in his children's book, Minions of the Moon. And I believe had he lived, he would have wrote more poems like this and could have achieved more fame again and kind of revitalized himself, reacting more to modernist themes. So here's The Wasteland. Briar and fennel and chinquapin and rue and ragweed everywhere. The field seems sick as a soul with sin, or dead of an old despair, born of an ancient care. The crickets cry and the locusts whir, and the note of a bird's distress, with the rasping sound of a grasshopper clung to the loneliness, like burrs to a ragged dress. So sad the field, so waste the ground, so cursed with an old despair, a woodchuck's burrow, a blind mole's mound, and a chipmunk's stony lair seemed more than it could bear. So solemn too, so more than sad, so droning lone with bees, I wondered what more could nature add to the sum of its miseries. And then I saw the trees, skeletons gaunt, that gnarled the place. Twisted and torn they rose, the tortured bones of a perished race, of monsters nor mortal knows. They startled the mind's repose, and a man stood there as still as moss, a lichen from that stared, an old blind hound that seemed at loss, forever around him fared, with a snarling fang half bared. I looked at the man, I saw him plain, like a dead weed gray and wan, or beneath, or a breath of dust. I looked again, and man and dog were gone, like wisps o'er the graying dawn. Were they a part of the grim death there, ragweed, fennel, and rue, or forms of the mind, an old despair, that there into semblance grew, out of the old grief I knew?
Now that's a powerful poem.
Right? This is Cawein at his finest. This is him showing you that, that death of nature, and then wondering aloud, is man going to follow? Man is both the cause of that death, but it's also a shadow that looms over it. And you wonder, is it going to take its toll with nature? Is it also going to become one of these gaunt skeletons?
Right. These tortured bones of a perished race.
Right?
Such a good line.
It's wild, And I just, that idea of the old man with the blind hound, like that's, it's terrifying. Very kind of satanic. Yeah. So I want to leave you with one last poem. This was one of the last poems he wrote before he died. It wasn't released in Minions of the Moon. It was for another book. It was in Minions of the Moon. Sorry, it got added at the end. And this is his reaction to this depression and to modernity. And he felt that his world was dying. So it's called The New God. I look about me and behold how all is changed. The sound insane, the kind, the true, the hale and old, that once made strong the features plain of life are cast in other mold, that bears the stamp of greed and gold, a god unclean, who drags a chain of bejeweled lust, which men call gain, binding their hearts to all that's vain. That God at last for punishment shall curse with woe and discontent.
Very soothing and forlorn.
To me, this was his most shocking kind of poem for someone who really knows the Hellenistic imagery, because he's, if you look at a lot of his nature poetry, nature's always the goddess. Okay. Nature is always feminine, and it's always this loving force. Here he's talking about Saturn. He's talking about God as time, as that angry man, as money, and as greed, And he's invoking that image of dragging the chains. That's Saturn who's bound in Tartarus. A bejeweled lust. That's him who's still striving for that ancient golden age that he lost, that he can't relinquish and let go of, And we all deserve to be punished like him who gets punished for that greed, for that striving of the scepter, Cursed with woe and discontent. I would say this is not a new God, though, Cawein. This is a God that's been with humanity for a long time. It just wasn't your God.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But yeah, so That's our man, Cawein, Madison Cawein. You
Very
know,
fascinating. He really embodies what we were looking for, which is someone who is engaged in magical practice in their writing and in their life, really. He came from a background with a rich vein of spiritualism and naturalism, which we can see informed every word that he wrote.
yeah. And he was really trying to embody that love and profess that love into the future. And he's an interesting conflicted character because on one hand he has this extraordinarily anti-materialistic side, but then he has this deep love and appreciation of art and beauty, and this desire to possess art and beauty. And that's something like I hard relate to, because if I was Cawein, I'd have a massive library and have a beautiful house in downtown Louisville, and I'd still go hiking in the woods too.
Yeah, you gotta have balance, right?
you know but like it's also it just reminds me too, his story, right, is that we need to learn to adapt and to embrace the new. There is a time for form and there is a time for letting go of form, and we can't be constrained and bound. It's funny because he talks about Saturn and the chains and the binding, like in that New God poem, but meanwhile he's binding himself and constraining himself to tradition and form. It's this really kind of, how can you not see it, Mr. Cawein? What you're rallying against, you're doing to yourself in a different way.
Yeah, it's like it's that recognition that form can guide us. Form is a good guideline, but not a signpost or like a gold standard. It's like I think we always have to abandon form at some point to dive into different aspects of ourselves, right? And then sometimes it helps to rely on form. It can provide like a structure. So like I can see the importance of form, and I see why he was so bound to it.
You know what? I really look at form, like poetic form, in the same way I look at musical genre. Okay. I love reggae. Anyone who knows me knows I'm reggae kind of crazy, and that has very strict rules in one sense, and I know what to expect when I put on a reggae song. There's a certain conformity, but I'm also demanding people bend those rules, and challenge that conformity at the same time. It's like the genre is a comfort, but I also want people to push it and to mix it with other things. Like there's a time and a place, right? What I want both. I want free jazz and I want reggae. You know what I mean? But
it's so true. It's like you can nestle in the comfort of a genre, but you want to. We do want people that are pushing the boundaries of what it means to be within that genre.
Yeah, what I think it is that imagination has no constraints. So often the art we create is defined by the rules that we place upon ourselves, because we have to limit our creation. The mind is infinite. If it just stays in the dream world, it can be whatever you want it to be. But as soon as you try to manifest it, it now has constraints, whether those are the physical limitations of reality or constraints you pose on them with something like a genre, or form, right? And those can be limiting or expanding, And I think a lot of Cawein's story too is about this this juxtaposition between trying to, on one hand, we all need to survive under this horrific capitalist nightmare that we're living in, and he's a model of the nightmare of capitalism. This is someone who was celebrated as a great artist, but then he was no longer the flavor of the week, and he went from being a huge success to nothing overnight. And there was no social safety net to take care of him,
No.
And it's like, I wonder, had he had access to proper health care and support, would he have died? It's a sad story. That was someone who was true to their art, and it killed them in a sense.
It's true. His passion ended up being his undoing in a way.
And it's that radical line we all wind up walking. Do you create art for yourself or for others? You know? And I think back to that poem we read at the very beginning where he was talking about his dad, you know, one who loved nature, you know? He kind of is, I think Cawein is sad that his dad never achieved fame. But he also reminds us in the poem that his dad never asked for fame. And nature didn't give it either. But he never asked for it, you know? And I think
Cawein, that he can make people's lives a little bit better.
Right? But Cawein clearly asked for fame, and he definitely received it in many different ways, you know? Lots to ponder. Any last ideas or things you want to say about Cawein there, Graham?
I think we've talked a lot. I just want to say that I think he was a fine choice to introduce the channel and stuff. I think that he is a perfect living embodiment of a magician artist.
I agree wholeheartedly, and that's what I chose him. So we're hopefully going to be back next week, same time. And if all goes well, you have an artist you wanted to bring. Do you want to talk a little bit about them?
So I don't want to spoil too much, but I've been working on some notes following Isidore Ducasse, or Le Comte de l'Autrement, who is known mostly for his work, the Songs of Maldoror, which it's a highly influential book in the modern art world, despite being written in the late 1800s. It was a major influence on the Surrealist movement and many movements to come. And you can see some influence in Artaud as well. So I thought that he also approaches poetry and prose from a magical perspective, but not in a way that is as typical. So I think he's going to be a unique, interesting figure to talk about.
I'm so looking forward to that. And I'm also going to be working on another person as well. And depending on what happens, I may be doing a presentation. And the person that I'm going to be talking about is a modern. I wanted to talk, since we talked about a traditionalist American, I wanted to talk about a modernist American. And since we talked about a man, I wanted to talk about a woman. And I want to talk about who may be my all-time favorite poet, bar none, which is H.D. is her pen name, or Hilda Doolittle. So she was really famous for being a partner of a lover of Ezra Pound, and being one of the founders of modernism and of the Imagist movement in poetry. And the Imagist movement was about reducing poetry to its absolute simplistic forms that were only about projecting that image, those pictures into your mind. And she wrote a lot in the Imagist style, but she also abandoned Imagism. And she was really famous for, she was a classicist in her own right in New Ancient Greek, and wrote a lot about these ancient Greek myths and incorporated them into her poems. And eventually she even abandons Imagist imagery as too limiting and goes off to create kind of like a lot of radical modern stuff that's truly like out there. But for me, what I really like about Hilda is she's this gap, like she does what Cawein didn't, which is she straddles tradition and modernity, you know, and she brings the ancient into the modern in a way that is just amazing. If you go on my channel, if you look under shorts, I've read several of her poems.
Amazing.
But yeah, so we'll be back with more incredible artists to talk about. And this has been so much fun, Graham. Thank you for listening to me rant. And I look forward to listening to you.
I feel like I learned a lot today.
And everyone, please go into the description below and you'll see Graham's link tree. You can support Graham's publication house. He publishes his own poetry as well as the poetry of others. And he has an amazing heavy metal band. What's your band called again? Sorry?
Ghosts of Shadow Moses.
Ghosts of Shadow Moses. All are located in the link tree. And please join us on the Discord, Myth and Lore. And I will see you guys tomorrow for Occult Explorers with Dion. Thanks again, Graham. And we'll see you all next week. This has been the first debut episode of Searching for Dragons. So peace and love, everyone. Hail Satan.